Can I hug you? The words arrive like a small, simple offering in the middle of a city that feels, at that moment, enormous and indifferent. It is 11 o'clock at night. A street lamp spills water-gold light across the curb where a man in a navy suit sits, shoulders shaking, suit jacket crumpled and damp at the elbows. He has sat there for a while, though he hasn't known what to do with time since the day imploded 12 hours earlier. He is 42. He is, until today, wealthy. He is, in the space of a single day, something else entirely. 12 hours earlier at 9 in the morning, his phone had rung with a number that began an avalanche. The securities call. A regulatory inquiry that started as a rumor had teeth now. Account freezes, searches, questions that gnashed at the scaffolding of a career built on swift decisions and quieter corners. By noon, his accounts were inaccessible. Numbers that had once made his chest swell were suddenly locked behind passwords and lawyers. At 2, papers arrived at the house. His wife had left a note and a courier with a stack of divorce documents. It was neat and transactional, the way the rest of his life had been months ago. Breakfast meetings, handshakes, the clink of glasses. At 3, the board convened and, in a brief and merciless meeting, removed him from the very company he had founded. He left that room with his laptop and a box of personal items. At 6, the city seemed louder. Flashes of camera strobes were already a harsh punctuation outside his building. At 9, an editor called to say the story was running with the kind of headline that does not leave room for nuance. By 11, he was on the curb beside his old office tower, the place where his name used to mean something like safety and proof. He had come back to the building not to beg or to fight, but to feel the place that had made him. He had come because grief needed a location. He had come because in the whiteness of the night it seemed at least honest that one could find a place to sit and be small. He did not expect a child. The boy walked toward him with a steady, uncomplicated gait. He was about 7, thin but not frail, with a mop of hair that had curls dusted with the city. His shoes were tied into knots and pushed past practical use. His bare feet had learned a new map of the pavement. He wore a shirt too big for him, faded to the color of tea. His hands were small and knobby, calloused where the skin had been roughened. Not from hard labor, but from a life taught quickly in the seasons between one meal and the next. He didn't hover or plead. He stepped up and stood a few feet from the man, looked him in the face with an unfazed gaze, as if deciding whether a stranger was worth a question. The light caught the boy's eyes. They were steady. "You look like you're tired," the boy said. The man laughed, a broken sound that became a sob. He had never imagined someone so small could be so precise. "I'm tired," he admitted. He wanted to wipe his face, but he had no towel, and the city air had a roughness to it tonight, a flinty salt of winter and old smoke. The boy tilted his head. "You still have your arms and legs?" he asked. A child's inventory, a way of measuring ruin by what still remained. The man managed a bitter smile. "Yes," he said, the words scraping as if his mouth was a new tool. "Yes, I do." The child nodded, the way a person nods at something obvious. "Then you're okay," he said. It was not a trivial sentiment. It was a simple math of survival, an incantation learned from someone who had to know what counted. "Do you live around here?" the man asked, voice low and unsure, as if he were still finding his footing in the grammar of asking for help and giving it. The boy shrugged. "Sometimes. My mom used to say there are lots of houses, but the important ones are what you make." There was a tenderness to that line, a piece of adult wisdom given in a child's wrapping. The man, David Westfield, felt the old scaffolding, wealth, name, reputation, dissolve into something smaller and more private. Shame. Not abstract shame, but the particular heavy kind that lodges in the throat and makes you unable to speak conveniently. Around them, the city pulsed with a life that did not stop to ask permission. A cab idled a block away. A woman in an overcoat walked her dog along the sidewalk. eyes fixed on the path. Inside the glass of the office tower, lights burned late. The differences were stark enough that they could have been cut out with the edge of a coin. Men who had built empires behind polished desks, and a child who had learned to keep his shoes tied in knots. The boy crouched down and put his face closer to the man. "What's wrong?" he asked. The man could have said a dozen things. He could have grandstanded, given a story about betrayal and numbers and boards, explained the legal labyrinth he now faced. He could have sworn and deflected. Instead, the truth came out of him like a slow exhale. "Everything," he said, and the word was nearly transparent. The boy's expression didn't change. He was listening like a person who had practiced mercy. "Money didn't buy happiness for my mom," he said. "She used to tell me that a lot. We had a jar once for kindness. She said kindness is the only thing that grows when you spend it." The phrase landed like a small coin. The man's thoughts spun into pictures, a childhood filled with catered events, a mother who wore respect like an accessory, words like success and ambition chanted until they became a prayer. He had been taught to see value as an aggregate, shares, properties, contingency plans. He had never been taught how to hold a child's hand without intending something in return. "Can I hug you?" the boy asked. When the words came, the man registered them first as absurd, then as implausible, then as irresistible. He thought of the headlines, the cameras, the meetings with stern-faced men who liked to talk about precedent. He thought of the boardroom table where his name had been carved into the back of a chair. He thought of his wife's ring sitting on a dresser in a house that suddenly felt like someone else's. He thought of all the things that needed arranging and explaining and paying for. He thought of punishment and the legal machinery that would now grind, impartial and cold. He had rehearsed his defenses for the world, but he had never rehearsed for an honest embrace. "Yes," he said. He did not say yes in the performative way of a man agreeing to a charity. He said yes the way a person given permission to undo rigidity might say it. The boy stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around the man's neck. And the man, who had for years been a master at hiding, at controlling rooms and conversations, let his arms go slack and folded around the child the way someone finally remembers how to breathe. The hug did not solve his legal problems. It did not unfreeze accounts. It did not bring his wife back or erase the headlines. But the physical pull of the small body into his own center did something else. It moved a stone lodged inside him. It shifted the axis of his thinking from defense to responsibility. The chest that had clenched with fear and anger began to rearrange itself into something like clarity. His shoulders burned with the heat of new shame and the salt of sudden relief. He heard the boys inhale, small and steady, as if the child were reciting an occupied prayer. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of breath and the texture of the boy's shirt against his cheek. The man's nails dug into his palms until the black fabric of his suit jacket wrinkled. When they separated, the child stepped back with the kind of casual boundary that seemed preternatural in one so young. "You can do better," he said simply. "Everyone can." David wanted to say that he had not been able to choose better. He wanted to say that the choices had been practical, necessary, cleverly executed. He wanted to say that everyone looked the other way, and that it was not only his failing. Instead, he heard himself say, "I know." They did not talk for long after that. The city was not an audience to their exchange, but the moments that followed were decisive in ways that the headlines could not name. David reached into his pocket and took out the last bills he had on him. Not a gesture of reckless charity, but a small recognition of shared humanity. He pressed the money into the boy's hand. The boy's fingers tightened around the notes and then looked up at him with a caution that was almost adult. "You should keep something," the boy said, "in case you need to buy lunch." David smiled at the boy's concern, an absurd human thing to be worried about. He tucked the child's hand in his own for a second longer and said, "Come with me." He did not mean at first to take the boy home. He meant to find immediate shelter, a safe place with a person whose job was to help children like Samuel. He meant to place the child within a system that could protect him and help with food and a warm bed, not to create a dependency on a stranger who might be gone the following morning. He wanted to do the right, practical thing beyond the single human warmth that had rearranged him. They walked a few blocks together. David's pace was slower than usual. He noticed things he had not allowed himself to notice before. The smell of hot bread from a corner bakery, the way steam from a grate ballooned and then dissolved. A mural painted on the side of a building half-finished, with a child's laugh immortalized in broad strokes of orange. The city felt ruinous and vivacious at once. At the shelter, a woman at a small intake desk looked up with a practiced kindness. She wore a coat with the shelter's logo, and there was a line of pens attached to strings. David listened as Samuel spoke in clipped sentences, giving his name, a rough account of his last safe place, the kind of information that helps adults find resources quickly. The director, middle-aged, steady, took the boy's hand, asked him what he liked to read, what he wanted for dinner, whether he had a sense of where relatives might be. Samuel answered with the economy of someone who had learned how to preserve his energy. The director offered him a cot for the night, a bowl of warm soup, and an appointment for a counselor in the morning. Those were practical things: rest, nourishment, professional support. They were also, in their smallness, a kind of sanctification against the harsh, anonymous city. David stood in the doorway while the director completed intake forms, with Samuel seated on a chair that almost swallowed him. He watched the boy hand over the money David had given him a few minutes earlier. The director did not take it as a payment. She folded it and tucked it into an envelope labeled "Personal." "We'll keep this safe," she said to Samuel, with the steady calm of someone accustomed to preserving dignity. "We can put it in your account here." The man turned to speak with the director after Samuel had been led to a small room with a cot and a blanket. He was no longer the man who had arrived 12 hours earlier with a private and precise plan to escape. The city had not changed his legal situation, but the instant with the child had realigned his priorities. He told the director, haltingly, about what had happened: the board vote, the frozen accounts, the media calls, the divorce. He did not try to excuse wrongdoing, because there was no excuse to offer. He explained, with a raw honesty that surprised him, that he intended to take responsibility for what he had done. He would answer questions, he said. He would face the consequences and pursue restitution, however long that might take. The director listened in that steady way that professionals do, less with the rhetoric of judgment than the mechanics of response. She did not tell him what to do in legal terms. She offered him a practical path forward. Ensure the boy's safety, follow through with the shelter staff who would manage meals and school re-entry, and, if he wished, volunteer on a regular basis to support services in the community as a way to give back in a literal and immediate sense. "Actions matter more than words," she said finally, with a plainness that felt like a kind of benediction. "If you want to start making things right, this is how." David did not respond with grand declarations. He promised small things, first to himself, then to the director, then aloud. He would not flee. He would meet the investigators, cooperate, and work to repair harm. He would make restitution to those wronged by his decisions, even when the path forward was long and uncertain. He would, if the process permitted, use whatever remained of his knowledge to support people who had been left out of the circles he had once dominated. He would sit with discomfort and let that discomfort be his teacher. The man who had been worth millions had been reduced overnight to an honest ledger of obligations. That precise exposure, no shelter of money, no buffer of prestige, brought something else in its wake. He felt the possibility of transformation, not as a golden rescue, but as a slow, deliberate way of living differently. Later, when David left the shelter, the air had a brittle cold that painted his breath in the streetlight. He walked back to the curb, where he had first sat. The city hummed with its usual indifference, but he felt different from the man he had been in the morning. He was less interested in what he could defend, and more interested in how he could repair. The hug had not fixed his past. It had not removed the necessity of being accountable. But it had given him a point of gravity to aim toward. Over the following days, while news cycles churned, David took concrete steps. He called his lawyer and agreed to cooperate openly. He drafted letters of apology to those who had been harmed by the choices he had made. He reached out to the people he had relied on during his rise, and admitted plainly his failings. He contacted the shelter's director to ask how he could help, not with statements or curated philanthropy, but with time and resources allocated through the programs that the shelter recommended. He offered to volunteer at evening programs several times a week, to help prepare meals, to sit with people who needed someone to talk to, actions that had the humility of routine rather than spectacle. There were days when the burden was heavier than the hug had promised. Investigation and process do not bend to human longing. There were legal interviews and private reckonings, bankers and auditors, and the kind of procedural exposure that is exhausting and precise. But in the spaces between appointments, David learned to be present to suffering in ways he had not allowed before. He sat across from men and women who had been on the other side of the table from him, the beneficiaries of decisions that had been made in rooms he had once run. He listened. Samuel remained a vivid presence in his life, though now mediated by the shelter's guidance. The shelter's staff coordinated visits and set boundaries appropriate for a child in care. David observed those boundaries. On prescribed days, he would sit in the common room while Samuel ate soup, and they would sometimes play a board game, or the child would draw with crayons and tell him about a book he liked. Samuel's mother, when the conversation turned to her, was a figure David was careful to protect. The shelter's counselors had an appropriate cadence to those disclosures. The point was not to excavate trauma for drama, but to attend to human people with dignity and respect. At a later meeting in a small conference room at the shelter, the director and a counselor explained the possibilities for Samuel: education support, family reunification programs when appropriate, counseling, and a path toward a stable placement. David listened and then asked if there were things he could do beyond the shelter. Whether the shelter needed supplies, whether there were long-term volunteer commitments that could help keep programs funded and staffed. The director outlined practical needs and vetted partners who did work with children and families, and she insisted, gently but firmly, that any support he offered be channeled through those institutions rather than given to minors directly on the street. It was an important boundary, a safeguard the child needed. So David moved from gesture to structure. He contributed to the shelter's programs, attended training to learn how to listen without overstepping, and began to build a pattern of accountability that had, until that day on the curb, been missing from his life. He also began the slow process of making amends in other arenas. He acknowledged wrongs to those he had harmed, sometimes in person, sometimes through legal channels. He accepted that restitution would be a long road. He accepted, too, that acting on remorse would require patience, not simply dramatic statements. The city watched in its ordinary way. The press ran stories about the fall and the man's new activities. But the thing that changed inside him was not beholden to headlines. It unfolded in mundane, repeated acts that made little copy: a roster of volunteer shifts, awkward but honest apologies to colleagues, the patient discipline of meeting process and accepting consequence. Samuel grew more secure at the shelter. He went back to school with the help of the shelter's education liaison. The director arranged for therapy and a small savings account held in trust. Samuel's statements about kindness being something that grows when you spend it stayed with David. He found himself thinking of that jar, of the mother who had taught her son to measure wealth differently. He had once measured worth by the breadth of an empire and the thickness of a ledger. He was learning to measure by the steadiness of a hand offered when someone needed it, by the patience to listen, by the willingness to give time and to accept correction. There were private evenings when the weight of his past choices pressed on him, and he would remember the feel of the child's arms around his neck and the particular sound of that small inhale. The memory of being held was not a ticket to forgiveness, but a reminder of the human ordering he now wished to pursue. He could not undo the damage in a single embrace, but the embrace had been the spark for a series of commitments. That reality made humility into a verb. He did not always act perfectly. He failed. He apologized again. He kept trying. Months later, when some of the initial noise had settled, David found himself in conversation with the director again about long-term engagement. The director had a candid manner. "We don't need trophies," she said. "We need steady people who show up, people who will accept that change is slow and messy." David accepted that. He became one of those steady people. He worked with the shelter to fund job training programs and partnered with vetted organizations to provide child-focused services. He visited the shelter not to be seen, but to learn how systems that help people actually work. He sat in orientation classes and took notes. He spoke with kids about possibilities and listened more than he talked. He met Samuel on the child's terms, celebrating small victories, an improved report card, a bookmark drawn by the boy, a joke that finally landed. There were moments of tension too. When people asked him how a man of his former standing could now live with diminished means, there was an awkwardness that reminded him of everything he'd lost. But he had traded clout for responsibility and comfort for clarity. The trade was not painless. It also offered a kind of profound honesty. You could measure your life by what you hoarded or by what you repaired. On more than one occasion, the motif, "Can I hug you?" resurfaced in David's memory. It was never a magical cure, only a pivot toward human humility. He realized that small acts, an embrace, an apology, sitting at a shelter table, did not absolve him. They redirected him. They required him to act in ways that were costly and sometimes slow. They turned a crisis into a curriculum. He also recognized that the city's systems were imperfect. A hug was not a policy. One man's fall did not fix social structures that left children vulnerable. But the child's question and the subsequent commitments showed how individual transformation can ripple into communal acts. When David funded a literacy program, it was not a grand statement, but a specific contribution, channeled through professionals who knew how to do the work without spectacle. When he sat in a job readiness class, he was not looking for praise. He was learning the reality of the work people do to keep themselves afloat. The story did not close with cinematic neatness. There were hearings and disclosures and restitution plans that required time. There were people who remained hurt and skeptical. David accepted that his new path would not erase pain and that repair would be measured over years. But there was, beneath the procedural motions, a slowly accumulating body of acts that made the world marginally better. A boy sleeping safely at night, a shelter with more steady funding, programs that connected people to stable work. And there was an interior truth that lodged in him. Real wealth had not been in accounts and headlines, but in being recognizable to other human beings. The hug had not been currency. It had been a summons to responsibility. When the camera lights and the columns of paper faded from urgency, David kept showing up. Samuel kept growing in the shelter's care. The director watched both men, amused sometimes by the ways adult privilege stumbled toward humility and touched at the same time by the very ordinary miracles of people learning to act differently. The city kept moving. But here and there, small things were different. A program with new funding, a volunteer who taught a class once a week, a child who started to trust adults in a new way. The night on the curb remained a late-night coordinate in David's memory. He could still call it up in bright detail. The lamp, the rumpled navy suit, the smell of exhaust and soup, the small hands. He could still hear the boy's voice, clear as a chime. "Can I hug you?" The question had been permission and invitation, an invitation to exchange performance for presence. If there is a practical lesson in the story, it is not that a single act redeems everything. It is that acts matter when they are part of a sustained commitment to repair and to care. The hug opened him. What followed? Shelter registration, program support, admissions of responsibility, quiet volunteer nights kept the opening alive. If this story moved you, consider supporting local shelters or vetted organizations that help vulnerable children and families. They need steady, reliable help more than symbolic gestures. And if you'd like more stories about unexpected reckonings and the small acts that change lives, subscribe to hear them when they come. The city keeps its rhythms. People keep showing up for each other. One small boy asked a broken man for permission to hug him, and the permission turned a moment into a new direction. It did not close the book on consequence, but it rewrote the next chapter into a story of responsibility, presence, and the slow work of making things right.